Hello everybody, and I've just seen in my channel, since I'm really a kid, I have already 7 subscribers. I am shocked. So we're reading Alex Rider's book of blah blah blah, you know that, and the second book of the series, Point Blanc, and we are on chapter 14, Black Run. Hoping to finish off the book today, actually. Just another 40 pages, you'd say. Let's finish this. Yeah, where's the page? Page 226 to 262. Let's finish off the book. Chapter 14, Black Run. The cell measured 2 meters by 4 meters and contained a bunk bed with no mattress and a chair. The door was solid steel. Alex had heard a key turn in the lock after it was closed. He had not been given anything to eat or drink. The cell was cold, but there were no blankets on the bed. At least the guards had left the handcuffs off. They had searched Alex expertly, removing everything they had found in his pockets. They had also removed his belt and the laces of his shoes. Perhaps Dr. Grief had thought he would hang himself. He needed Alex fresh and alive for the biology lesson. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning, but Alex hadn't slept. He had tried to put out of his mind everything what Grief had told him. That wasn't important now, though. He knew that he had to escape before 9:30 because, like it or not, it seemed he was on his own. More than 36 hours had passed since he had pressed the panic button. But that Smithers had given him, and nothing had happened. Either the machine hadn't worked, or for some reason MI6 had decided not to come. Of course, it was possible that something might happen before breakfast the next day, but Alex wasn't prepared to risk it. He had to get out tonight. For the 20th time, he went over to the door. He knelt down, listening carefully. The guards had dragged him back down to the basement. He was in a corridor separate from the other prisoners. Although everything had happened very quickly, Alex had tried to remember where he was being taken out. Out of the lift and turn left. Round the corner and then down a second passage to a door at the end. He was on his own and listening through the door. He was fairly sure that they hadn't posted a guard outside. It had to be now, the middle of the night when they had searched him. The guards hadn't quite taken everything. Neither of them had even noticed the gold stud in his ear. What had Smithers said? It's a small but very powerful explosive. Separating the 2 pieces activates it, count to 10, and it'll blow a hole in just about anything. Now's the time to put it to the test. Alex reached up and unscrewed the ear stud. He pulled it out of his ear, slipped the 2 pieces into the keyhole of the door, stepped back and counted 10. Nothing happened. Was the stud broken? Like the GPS transmitter, Alex was about to give up when there was a sudden flash and an intense sheet of orange flames. Fortunately, there was no noise. The flare continued for about 5 seconds. Then burned a hole in it, the size of a 2-pound coin. The melted metal was still glowing. Alex reached out and pushed the door. The door swung open. Alex felt a momentary surge of excitement, but he forced himself to remain calm. He might be out of the cell, but he was still in the basement of the academy. There were guards everywhere. He was on top of a mountain with no skis and no obvious way down. He wasn't safe yet, not by a long way. He slipped out of the room and followed the corridor back round to the lift. He was tempted to find the other boys and release them, but he knew that they couldn't help. Taking them out of the cells would only put them in danger. Somehow he found his way back to the lift. He noticed that the guard post he had seen that morning was empty. Either a man had gone to make himself a coffee, or Grief had relaxed security in the academy. When Alex and all the other boys looked up, there were nobody left to guard, or so they thought. Alex hurried forward. It seemed that luck was on his side. He shoved the lift back to the first floor. He knew that his only way out of the mountain lay in his bedroom. Grief would certainly have examined everything he had brought with him, but what would he have done with it? Alex crept down the dimly lit corridor and into his room, and there it all was, lying in a heap on his bed. The ski suit, the goggles, even the remaining plastic packets of hand warmers. Alex heaved a sigh of relief. He was going to need all of it. He already worked out what he was going to do. He couldn't ski off the mountain. He still had no idea where the skis were kept, but there was more than one way to take to the snow. Alex froze as the guard walked along the corridor outside the room. Not everyone at the academy was asleep. He would have to move fast. As soon as the broken cell door was discovered, the alarm would be raised. He waited until the guard had gone, then stole into the laundry room for a few doors down. When he came out, he was carrying a long, flat object made of light-well aluminium. He carried it onto his bedroom, closed the door, and turned on one small lamp. He was afraid that the guard would see the light if he returned, but he couldn't work in the dark. It was a risk. He had to take it. He had stolen an ironing board. He had only been snowboarding 3 times in his life. The first time he had spent most of the day falling or sitting on his bottom. Snowboarding is a lot harder to learn than skiing. But as soon as you get the hang of it, you can advance fast. By the 3rd day, Alex had learned how to ride, edging and cutting his way down the beginner's slopes. He needed a snowboard now. The ironing board would have to do. He picked up the two of the hand warmers and tore them open. Quickly, he manipulated the grey putty and pressed underneath the metal surface. He hoped he'd got it right. The ironing board was wider than he would have liked. He knew that the longer the board, the faster he could go, but if he'd left it too long, he would have no control. The ironing board was flat, without any curve at all in the front or nose, as it was called. He would be at the mercy of every bump or upturned root. But there was nothing he could do. There was a hiss, and once again smoke rose into the air as the putty ate into the metal, cutting it into the shape Alice had wanted. About half the ironing board fell away. Being careful not to burn his hands on the still smouldering edges, Alex levered up the other half. It almost reached his chest, with a point at one end and a curve at the back. Perfect! He used more of the putty to burn off the support, leaving about 6 centimeters sticking up. He knew that the rider and the board can only work together if the bindings are right. And he had nothing, no boots, no straps, no high back to support his heel. He was just going to have to improvise. While the metal cooled, he tore 2 strips of sheet from the bed, then slipped into his ski suit. He would have to tie one of his trainers to what was left of the ironing board's supports. It was horribly dangerous. If he fell, he would dislocate his foot. But he was almost ready. Quickly, Alex zipped up the ski suit. Smithers had said it was bulletproof, and it occurred to him that he was probably going to need it now. He put the goggles around his neck. The window still hadn't been repaired. He dropped the ironing board out, then climbed out after it. There was no moon now. Alex found the switch concealed in the goggles and turned it. He heard a soft hum as the hidden battery activated, and suddenly the size of a mountain glowed an eerie green, and Alex was able to see the trees and the deserted ski run falling away. He carried the ironing board over to the edge of the snow and used the sheet to tie it into his foot. Carefully, he hooked up his position, his right foot at 40 degrees. His left foot at 20. He was goof-footed. That was what the instructor had told him. His feet should have been the other way around, but this was no time to worry about technique. Alex stood where he was, contemplating what he was about to do. He had only ever done green and blue runs, the colours given to the beginner and intermediate slopes. He knew from James that this mountain was an expert black all the way down. His breath rose up in green clouds in front of his eyes. Could he do it? Could he trust himself? An alarm bell exploded behind him. Lights came on throughout the academy. Alex pushed forward and set off, picking up speed with every second. The decision had been made for him. Now, whatever happened, there could be no going back. Dr. Grief, wearing a long silver dressing gown, stood beside the open window in Alex's room. Miss Stellenbosch was also in a robe. Hers was pink silk and looked strangely hideous, hanging off her lumpy body. 3 guards stood watching them, waiting for instructions. Who searched the boy? Dr. Grief asked. He had already been shown the cell door with a circular hole burnt into the lock. None of the guards answered, but their faces had gone pale. This is a question to be answered in the morning, Dr. continued. For now, all that matters is that we find him and kill him. He must be walking down the mountainside. He must be walking down the mountainside, Miss Stellenbosch said. He has no skis. He won't make it. We can wait until the morning and pick him up in the helicopter. I think the boy might be more inventive than we believe. Dr. Grief picked up the remains of the ironing board. You see, he has improvised some sort of sleigh toboggan. All right, he had come to a decision. Miss Stellenbosch was glad to see the certainty return to his eyes. I am 2 men on snowmobiles following him down the now. One of the guards hurried out of the room. What about the unit at the foot of the mountain? Miss Stellenbosch said. Indeed. Dr. Grief smiled. He had always kept a guard and a driver at the end of the last valley, in case anybody ever tried to leave the academy on skis. It was a precaution that was about to pay off. Alex Slider will have to arrive in La Vallée de Fer. Whatever he is using to get that down, he'll be unable to cross the railway line. We can have a machine gun set up waiting for him. Assuming he does manage to get the far, he'll be a seat in the dark. Excellent, Miss Stellenbosch purred. I would have liked to watch him die, but yes, the boy has no hope at all, and we can return to the bed. Alex was on the edge of space, seemingly falling to certain death. The snowboarding language, he was catching air, meaning that he had shot away from the ground. Every 10 meters he went forward, the mountainside disappeared another 5 meters downward. He felt the world spin around him, the wind whipped into his face. Then somehow he brought himself in line with the next section of the slope and shot down, steering the ironing board even further from Point Blanc. He was moving at a terrifying speed, trees and rock formations passing in a luminous green blur across his night vision goggles. In some way, the steeper slopes made it easier. At one point, he had tried to make a landing on a flat part of the mountain, a tabletop top, to slow himself down. He had hit the ground with such a bone-shattering crash that he had nearly blacked out, and had taken the next 20 meters almost totally blind. The ironing board was shuddering and shaking crazily, and it took all his strength to make the turns. He was trying to follow the natural falling of the mountain, but there was too many obstacles in the way. What he was most dreaded was melted snow. If the board landed on a patch of mud at this speed, he would be thrown and killed. And he knew that the further down he went, the greater the danger would become. But he had been travelling for 5 minutes, and so far he had only fallen twice. both times into thick banks of snow that had protected him. How far down could it be? He tried to remember what James Prince had told him, but thinking it was impossible at the speed he was having to use every ounce of his consciousness thought simply to stay upright. He reached a small lip where the surface was level and drove the edge of the board into the snow, bringing himself to a skidding halt. Ahead of him, the ground fell away alarmingly. He hardly dared to look down. There were thick clumps of trees to the left and to the right. In the distance, there was a green blur. The goggles could only see so far. And then he heard the noise coming up behind him. The scream of at least two, maybe more engines. Alex looked back over his shoulder for a moment. There was nothing. But then he saw a black fly swimming into his field of vision. There were two of them heading his way. Grief's men were riding specially adapted Yamaha Mountain Max snowmobile equipped with 700cc triple-cylinder engines. The bikes were flying over the snow on their 141-inch tracks, effortlessly moving 5 times faster than Alex. The 300-watt headlight had already picked him out. Now the men sped towards him, cutting the distance between them with every second that passed. Alex leaped forward, diving into the next slope. At the same moment, there was a sudden shatter. A series of distant cracks and snow leaped up all around him. Greek's men had machine guns built into their snowmobiles. Alex yelled that he swooped down the mountainside, barely able to control the sheet of metal under his feet. The makeshift binding was tearing at his ankle. The whole thing was vibrating crazily. He couldn't see. He could only keep going, trying to keep his balance, hoping that the way ahead was clear. The headlights of the nearest Yamaha shot out. Alex saw his own shadow stretching ahead of him on the snow. There was another shatter from the machine gun, and Alex ducked down, almost feeling the fan of bullets spray over his head. The second bike screamed up, going parallel with him. He had to get off the mountainside, otherwise he would be shot or run over. Or both. He forced the board onto its edge. Making a turn, he had seen a gap in the trees, and he made for it. Now he was racing through the forest, with branches and trunks whipping past like crazy animations in a computer game. Could the snowmobiles follow him through here? The question was answered by another burst from the machine guns, ripping through the leaves and branches. Alex searched for the narrower path. The board shuddered and he was almost thrown forward. Head first. The snow was getting thinner. He edged and turned, heading for both heading. He passed between them with a millimeter spare. Follow that. The Yamaha snowmobile had no choice. The rider had run out of paths. He was travelling too fast to stop. He tried to follow Alex between the trees, but the snowmobile was too wide. Alex had the collision. There was a terrible crunch, then a scream, then an explosion. As a ball of orange flame leaped over the tree, sending black shadows into a crazy dance ahead of him. Alex saw another hillock, and beyond it, a gap in the trees. It was time to leave the forest. He swooped up the hillock and out, once again catching the air. As he left the trees behind him, 2 meters above the ground, he saw the second snowmobile. It had caught up with him for a moment. The two of them were side by side. Alex doubled forward and grabbed the nose of his board. Still in midair, he twisted the tip of the board, bringing the tail swinging round. He had timed it perfectly. This tail slammed into the second rider's head, almost throwing him out of his seat. The rider yelled and lost control. His snowmobile jerked sideways as if trying to make an impossibly tight turn. Then it left the ground, cartwheeling over and over again. The rider was thrown off, then screamed as the snowmobile completed its final turn and landed on top of him. Man and machine were bounced across the surface of the snow, and then lay still. Alex slammed into the snow and skidded to a halt, his breath clouding green in front of his eyes. A second later, he pushed off again. Ahead of him, he could see that all the pists were leading into a single valley. This must be the bottleneck called La Vallée des Fers. I am a French speaker, so I can speak a little bit French, but I'm not very good. Where is it? There it is. So called La Vallée des Fers. So he'd actually done it. He'd reached the bottom of the mountain, but now he was trapped. There was no other way round. He could see lights in the distance, a city, safety, but he could also see the railway line, stretching right across the valley, from left to right, protected both sides by an embankment and a barbed wire fence. The glow from the city illuminated everything. On one side, the track came out of the mouth of a tunnel. It ran for about 100 meters in a straight line before a sharp bend carried it round the other side of the valley and disappeared from sight. The two men in the grey van saw Alex snowboarding towards them. They were parked on a road on the other side of the railway line and had been waiting for only a few minutes. They hadn't seen the explosion and wondered what had happened to the two cars on their snowmobiles. But that wasn't their concern. Their orders were to kill the boy. There he was, right out in the open, expertly managing the last black run through the valley. Every second brought him closer to them. There was nowhere from him to hide. The machine gun was a Belgian FNMAG and would cut him in half. Alex saw the van. He saw the machine gun aiming at him. He couldn't stop. It was too late to change direction. He had come this far, but now he was finished. He felt the strength draining out of him. Where were MI6? Why did he have to die out here on his own? There was a sudden blast as the train thundered out of the tunnel. It was a goods train, travelling at about 20 miles an hour. It had at least 30 carriages pulled by a diesel engine, and it formed a moving wall between Alex and the gun, protecting him. But it would only be there for a few seconds. He had to move fast. Barely knowing what he was doing, Alex found a last mound of snow and used it as a launch pad. Swept up into the air. Now he was level with the train. Now above it. He shifted his weight and came down onto the roof of one of the carriages. The surface was covered in ice, and for a moment he thought he would fall off the other side, but he managed to swing round so that he was snowboarding along the carriage tops, jumping from one to another. At the same time, being swept along the track away from the gun in a blast of freezing air. He had done it. He had got away. He was still sliding forward, the train adding its speed to his own, but no snowboarder had ever moved so fast. But then the train reached the bend in the track. The board had no purchase on the icy surface. As the train sped round to the left, the centrifugal force threw Alex to the right. Once again he soared into the air, but he had finally run out of snow, and he hit the ground like a rag doll. The snowboard was torn off his feet. He bounced twice into a wire fence and came to rest with blood spreading around a deep gash in his head. His eyes were closed. The train ploughed on through the night. Alex lay still. Chapter 15. After the funeral. The ambulance raced down the Avenue Marcus de Gressivondren in the north of Grenoble, heading towards the river. It was 5 o'clock in the morning. There was no traffic yet. No need for the siren. Just before the river, it turned off into a compound of ugly modern buildings. This was the second biggest hospital in the city. The ambulance pulled up outside the service des urgencies. Paramedics ran towards it as the back doors flew open. Miss Jones got out of her hired car and watched as the limp, unmoving body was lowered on a stretcher, transferred to a trolley, and rushed in through the double doors. There was already a saline drip attached to his arm. An oxygen mask covered his face. It had been snowing up in the mountains, but now here there was only a dull drizzle sweeping across the pavement. A doctor in a white coat was bending over the stretcher. He sighed and shook his head. Miss Jones saw this. She crossed the road and followed the stretcher in. A thin man with close cropped hair, wearing a black jersey and padded waistcoat, had also been watching the hospital. He saw Miss Jones without knowing who she was. He had also seen Alex. He took out the mobile and made a call. Dr. Grief would want to know. 3 hours later, the sun had risen over the city, Grenoble is largely modern, and even with its perfect mountain setting, it struggles to be attractive. On this damp, cloudy day, it was clearly failing. Outside the hospital, a car drew up, and Eva Stellenbosch got out. She was wearing a silver and white chessboard suit with a hat perched on her ginger hair. She carried a leather handbag, and for once she had put on makeup. She wanted to look elegant. She looked like a man in drag. She walked into the hospital and found the main reception desk. There was a young nurse sitting behind a bank of telephones and computer screens. Miss Stellenbosch addressed her in fluent French. Excuse me, she said. I understand that the young boy was brought here this morning. His name is the Alex Defender. One moment, please. The nurse entered the name into her computer. She heard the information on the screen and her face became serious. May I ask who they are? I'm the assistant director of the academy at Point Blanc. He is one of our students. Are you aware of the extent of his injuries, madame? I was told that he was involved in a snowboarding accident. Miss Stellenbosch took out a small handkerchief and dabbed at her eyes. He tried to snowboard down the mountains at night. He was involved in a collision with a train. His injuries are very serious, madame. The doctors are operating on him now. Miss Stellenbosch nodded, swallowing her tears. My name is Eva Stellenbosch, she said. May I wait for any news? Of course, madame. Miss Stellenbosch took a seat in the reception area. The next hour, she watched as people came and went. Some walking, some in wheelchairs. There were other people waiting for news for other patients. One of them, she noticed, was a very serious-looking woman with black hair, badly cut, and very black eyes. She was from England, glancing occasionally at a copy of the London Times. Then the door opened and a doctor came out. Doctors have certain face when they come to give bad news. This doctor had it now. Madame de Stellenbosch? Yes. You are the director of the school, yes? The assistant director, yes. The assistant director, the doctor said next to her, I am very sorry, madame. Alex's friend died a few minutes ago. He waited while she absorbed the news. He had multiple fractures. His arms, his collarbone, his leg. He had also fractured his skull. We operated, but unfortunately there had been massive internal bleeding. He went into shock and we were unable to bring him around. Miss Stellenbosch nodded, struggling for words. I must notify his family, he whispered. Is he from this country? No, he the English. His father, Sir David Friend. I'll have to tell him. Miss Stellenbosch got to her feet. Thank you, Doctor. I'm sure you did everything you could. Out of the corner of her eye, Miss Stellenbosch noticed that a woman with black hair had also stood up, letting her newspaper fall to the floor. She had overheard the conversation. She was looking shocked. Both women left the hospital at the same time. Neither of them spoke. The aircraft waiting on the runway was a Lockheed Martin C-130 Hercules. It had landed just after midday. Now waited beneath the clouds while 3 vehicles drove towards it. One was a police car, one a jeep, and one an ambulance. The St. Gilles Airport at Grenoble does not see many international flights, but this plane had flown out from England that morning. From the other side of the perimeter fence, Miss Stellenbosch watched through a pair of high-powered binoculars. A small military escort had been formed. 4 men in French uniform had lifted up a coffin which seemed pathetically small when balanced on their broad shoulders. The coffin was simple. pine wood with silver handles. A Union Jack was folded in a square in the middle. Marching in time, they carried the coffin towards the waiting plane. Miss Stenbosch spoke with binoculars and saw the woman from the hospital. She'd been travelling in the police car. She stood watching as the coffin was loaded into the plane, then got back into the car and was driven away. By now, Miss Stenbosch knew who she was. Dr. Grieve kept extensive files and quickly identified her as Miss Jones, deputy to Alan Blanc, head of special operations for MI6. Miss Stenbosch stayed until the end. The doors of the plane were closed. The jeep and the ambulance left. The plane's propellers began to turn and it lumbered forward onto the runway. A few minutes later it took off, and as it thundered into the air, the clouds opened as if to receive it, and for a moment its silver wings were bathed in brilliant sunlight. Then the clouds rolled back, and the plane disappeared. Miss Stenbosch took out her mobile. She dialed a number and waited until she was connected. "The little swing has gone," she said. She got back into her car and drove away. After Miss Jones had left the airport, she returned to the hospital and took the stairs to the second floor. She came to a pair of doors guarded by a policeman who nodded and let her pass through. On the other side was a corridor leading to a private wing. She walked down to the door. This one also guarded. She didn't knock. She went straight in. Alex Ryder was standing by the window looking out of the view of Grenoble. On the other side of the river Isle, outside high above him, 5 steel and glass bubbles moved slowly along a cable, ferrying tourists up to the fort de la Bastille. He turned around and Miss Jones came in. There was a bandage around his head, but otherwise he seemed unhurt. "You're lucky to be alive." "I thought I was dead." Let's hope Dr. Grieve believes as much. Despite herself, Miss Jones couldn't keep the worry out of her eyes. "Really, what a miracle," he said. "You should have at least broken something." "The suit protected me," Alex said. He tried to think back to the whirling, desperate moment when he had been thrown off the train and stuff. There was undergrowth and the fence sort of caught me. He rubbed his leg and winced. Even if it was barbed wire. He walked back to the bed and sat down. After they had finished examining him, the French doctors had brought him fresh clothes, military clothes. He noticed, combat jacket and trousers. He had hoped they weren't trying to tell him something. "I've got 3 questions, but let's start with the big one. I called for help 2 days ago. Where were you?" "I'm sorry, Alex," Miss Jones said. "There were logistical problems." Yes. Well, while you were having your logistical problems, Dr. Ruth was getting ready to cut me up. We couldn't just storm the academy. That could have got you killed. It could have got you all killed. We had to move in slowly, try and work out what was going on. How do you think we found you so quickly?" That was my second question. Miss Jones shrugged. "We have people in the mountains, and ever since we got your signal, they've been closing in on the academy. They heard the machine gun fire when the snowmobiles were chasing you and followed you down on the skis. They saw what happened with the train and radioed for help." "All right, so why all the business with the funeral? Why do you want Dr. Ruth to think I'm dead?" "That's simple, Alex. For what you've told us, he's keeping 15 boys prisoner in the academy. These are the boys that he plans to replace." She shook her head. "I have to say, it's the most incredible thing I've ever heard, and I wouldn't have believed it if I'd heard it from anyone else except you." You're too kind. If Dr. Grieve thought you'd survived last night, the first thing he would do is kill every one of those boys. Or perhaps he'd use them as hostages. We only had one hope. If we were going to take him by surprise, he had to believe you were dead." You're going to take him by surprise?" "We're going in tonight. I told you. We've assembled an attack squad here in Grenoble. They were up in the mountains last night. They plan to set off as soon as it's dark. They're armed and they're experienced." Miss Jones hesitated. "Ugh. There's just one thing they don't have. And what's that? Alex asked, feeling a sudden sense of unease. They need someone who knows the building, Miss Jones said. The library, the secret lifts, the placement of the guards, the passage with the cells. No way, Alex exclaimed. Now I understood the military clothes. Forget it, I'm not going back up there. I almost got killed trying to get away. Do you think I'm mad? Alex, you'll be looked after. You'll be completely safe. No. Miss Jones nodded. All right, I can understand your feelings, but there's someone I want you to meet. As if for one cue, there was a knock on the door, and it opened to reveal a young man, also in combat dress. The man was well built with black hair, square shoulders, and a dark, watchful face. He was in his late 20s. He saw Alex and shook his head. Well, let's turn up for the books, he said. How's it going, cub? Alex recognized him at once. He was a soldier he had known as Wolf. When MI6 had sent him for 11 days SAS training in Wales, Wolf had been in charge of his unit. If training had been hell, Wolf had only made it worse, picking on Alex from the start and almost getting him thrown out. In the end, though, it had been Wolf who had nearly lost his place with the SAS, and Alex who had saved him, but Alex still wasn't sure where that had left him, and the other man was giving nothing away. Wolf? Alex heard. I heard you had got busted up, Wolf said. I'm sorry, I forgot the flowers and a bunch of grapes. What are you doing here? Alex asked. They called me in to clear up the mess you left behind you. So where were you when I was being chased down the mountains? Seems you were doing fine on your own. Miss Jones took over. Alex has done a very good job up to now, she said. The fact is that there are 15 young prisoners up at Point Blanc, and our first priority must be to save them. From what Alex had told us, we know there are about 30 guards in and around the school. The only chance those boys have is for SAS unit to break in. It's happening tonight, she told Alex. The unit will be commanded by Wolf. The SAS never use rank when they are on active service, but Miss Jones was careful on only to use Wolf's code name. Where does the boy come into this? Wolf demanded. He knows the school, he knows the positions of the guards and the location of the prison cells. He can lead you to the lift. He can tell us everything we need to know. He can tell us everything we need to know here and now, Wolf interrupted. He turned to Miss Jones. We don't need a kid, he said. He's just going to be baggage. We're going in on skis. Maybe there'll be blood. I can't waste one of my men holding his hand. I don't need to have my hand held, Alice retorted angrily. She's right. She's right. I know more about Point Blanc than any of you. I've been there, or I got out of there. No thanks to you also. I met some of those boys. One of them is a friend of mine. I promised I'd help him, and I will. Not if you get killed. I can look after myself. Then it's agreed, Miss Jones said. Alex will lead you in there, but then we'll take no further part in operations. And as for his safety, Wolf, I hold you personally responsible. Personally responsible, right? Wolf growled. I couldn't resist a smile. He'd held his ground, and he'd been going back in with the SAS. Then he realised a few moments ago that he'd been arguing violently against doing just that. He glanced at Miss Jones. She manipulated him, of course, bringing Wolf into the room, and she knew it. Wolf nodded. All right, cub, he said. Looks like you're in. Let's go play. Sure, Wolf. Alex sighed. Let's go play. Chapter 17. Sorry, I have no idea what chapter I'm on, actually. Yeah, no. Chapter 16. Night Raid. They came skiing down from the mountain. There were 7 of them. Wolf was the leader. Alex was at his side. The other 5 men who followed. They'd changed into white trousers, jackets, and hoods. Camouflage that would help them blend into the snow. A helicopter had dropped them 2 kilometers north of and 200 meters above Point Blanc, and equipped with night vision goggles, they had quickly made their way down. The weather had settled again. The moon was out. Despite himself, Alex enjoyed the journey. The whisper of the skis cutting through the ice. The empty mountains bathed in white light, and he was part of a crack SAS unit. He felt safe. But then the academy loomed up below him. And once again he shivered. Before they had left here, he had asked for a gun. But Wolf had shaken his head. I'm sorry, Carpet's orders. You get us in, then you get out of sight. There were no lights showing in the building. The helicopter crouched on the helicopter like a helipad, like a glittering insect. Like a glittering insect. The ski jump stood to one side, dark and forgotten. There was nobody in sight. Wolf held up a hand and they slid to a halt. Guards, he whispered. 2 patrolling on the roof. Let's take him out first. Miss Jones had made her instructions clear. There was no bloodshed unless absolutely necessary. The mission was to get the boys out. The SAS could take care of Dr. Grief, Miss Stellenbosch and the guards at a later date. Now, Wolf held out a hand and one of the other men passed him something. It was a crossbow, not medieval, sort of sophisticated, high-tech weapon with a micro-flight aluminium barrel and laser scope. He loaded it with an anesthetic dart, lifted up and took aim. Alex saw him smile to himself, then his finger curled and the dart flashed across the night, travelling at 100 meters a second. There was a faint sound from the roof of the academy. It was as if someone had coughed. Wolf lowered the crossbow. One down, he said. Sure, Alex muttered. About 29 to go. Wolf signalled and they continued down, more slowly down. They were about 20 meters from the school when they saw the main door open. 2 men walked out, machine guns hanging from their shoulders. At once the SAS men veered to the right, disappearing from the round side of the school. They stopped within reach of the wall, dropping down, lie flat on their stomachs. 2 of them hadn't moved. Slightly ahead, Alex noted that they had kicked off their skis. At the very same moment, they had come to a halt. The 2 guards approached. One of them was talking quietly in German. Alex's face was half buried in the snow. He knew that the combat clothes would make them invisible. He half lifted his head just in time to see 2 figures rise out of the ground like ghosts from the grave. 2 crosses swung in the moonlight. The guards crumbled. In seconds they were tied up and gagged. They wouldn't be going anywhere that night. Wolf signalled again. The men got up and ran forward, making for the main door. Alex hastily pulled his own skis off and followed. They reached the door in a line, their backs against the wall. Wolf looked inside to check that it was safe. He nodded. They went in. They were in the hall with the stone dragons and the animal heads. Alex found himself next to Wolf and quickly gave him his bearings, pointing out the different rooms. The library? Wolf whispered. He was totally serious. The library? Wolf whispered. He was totally serious now. Alex could see the tension in his eyes. Through here. Wolf took a step forward and crouched down. He started whipping into one of the pouches of his jacket. Another guard had appeared, patrolling the lower corridor. Dr. Grief was taking no more chances. Wolf waited out until the man had gone past and nodded. One of the SAS men went after him. Alex heard a thud and the clatter of a gun dropping. So far, so good. They went into the library. Alex showed Wolf how to summon the lift, and Wolf whistled softly. As a suit of armour smoothly divided into 2 parts. This is a quiet place, he muttered. This is a quiet place, he muttered. Are you going up or down? Down. Let's make sure the kids are all right. There was just room for all 7 of them in the lift. Alex had warned Wolf about the guard at the table, within sight of the lift, and Wolf had took no chances. He came out firing. In fact, there were 2 guards there. One of them was holding a mug of coffee, the other lighting a cigarette. Wolf fired twice. 2 more anesthetic darts travelling the short distance along the corridor and found their targets. Again, it all happened in almost silence. The two guards collapsed and lay still. The SAS men stepped out into the corridor. Suddenly, Alex remembered. He was angry with himself for not mentioning it before. "You can't go into the cells," he whispered. "They're wired up for sound." Wolf nodded. "Show me." And it showed Wolf the passage with the steel doors. Wolf pointed to one of the men. "I want you to stay here. If we have found this is the first place grief will come." The man nodded. He understood. The rest of them went back to the lift, up to the library and out into the hall. Wolf turned to Alex. We're going to have to deactivate the alarm," he explained. "Do you have any idea?" "This way. Grief's private rooms are on the other side." Before he could finish, 3 more guards appeared, walking down the passage. Wolf shot one of them, another anti-sig dart, and one of his men took out the other 2. But this time they were a fraction of a second too slow. Alex saw one of the guards bring his gun round. He was probably unconscious before he managed to fire, but the last moment his finger tightened on the trigger, bullets sprayed upwards, smashing into the ceiling, throwing plaster and wood splinters showering down. But nobody had been hit, but the damage had been done. The lights flashed on, and the alarm began to ring. 2 meters away, the door opened and more guards poured through. "Down!" Wolf shouted. He produced a grenade. He tugged the pin out and threw it. Alex hit the ground, and a second later there was a soft explosion as a grey cloud of tear gas filled the far end of the passage. The guards staggered, blind and helpless. The SAS men quickly took them out. Wolf grabbed hold of Alex and dragged him close. "Find somewhere to hide," he shouted. "You've got us in. We'll do the rest now." Give me a gun," Alex shouted back. Something with the gas had reached him, and he could feel his eyes burning. "No, I got orders." At the first sign of trouble, You're to get out of the way. Find somewhere safe. We'll come for you later." "What, Wolf?" But Wolf was already up and running. Alex heard machine gun fire coming from somewhere below. So Wolf had been right. One of the guards had been sent to take care of the prisoners, but there had been an SAS man waiting for him, and now the rules had changed. SAS couldn't afford to risk the lives of the prisoners. There was going to be bloodshed, and Alex could only imagine that the battle that must be taking place. But he was to be no part of it. His job was to hide. More explosions, more gunfire. There was a bitter taste in Alex's mouth as he made his way back to the stairs. It was typical of MI6. Half the time they would happily get him killed. The other half, they treated him like a child. Suddenly a guard appeared, running towards the sound of the fighting. Alex's eyes were still smarting from the gas, and now he made use of it. He brought his hand to his face, pretending to cry. The guard saw a 14-year-old boy in tears. He stopped at that moment. Alex twisted around on his left foot, trying the upper part of his foot sideways into the man's stomach. The roundhouse kick, or Mawashi Gari, he had learned in karate. The guy didn't even have time to cry out. His eyes rolled and he went limp. Alex felt a little better after that, but there was still nothing more for him to do. There was another round of gunfire, then a quiet blast of a second gas grenade. Alex looked inside the room. From here, he could look out through the window at the side of the building and the helicopter pad. He noticed that the blades of the helicopter was turning. Somebody was inside it. He moved closer to the window. It was Dr. Grief. He had to let Wolf know. He turned around. Miss Stellenbosch was standing in front of him. He had never seen her look less human. Her entire face was contorted with anger. Her lips rolled outwards. Her eyes ablaze. "You didn't die!" she exclaimed. "You're still alive! You're still alive!" Her voice was almost a whine, as if somehow none of it had been there. "You brought them here, you own everything." That's my job," Alex said. "What was it that made me look in here?" Miss Stenlock giggled to herself. I could see what little sanity she had left was slipping away. Well, at least this one bit of business I'm finally going to be able to finish. I sensed himself Peter Park's center of gravity low, just like he had been taught, but it was useless. Miss Stellenbosch lurched into him, moving with frightening speed. It was like being run over by a bus, but Alex felt the full impact of her body weight and cried out as 2 massive hands seized hold of him and threw him head first across the room. He crashed into a table, knocking it over, then rolled out of the way as Miss Stenbush followed up her first attack, lashing out with a kick that would have taken his head off his shoulders. If it hadn't missed by less than a centimetre, he scrambled to his feet and stood there, panting for breath. For a moment, his vision was blurred. Blood trickled out of the corner of his mouth. Miss Stenbush charged again. Alex threw himself forward, using another of the tables for leverage. His feet swung round, scything through the air. Both as he was catching her on the back of the head. Anyone else would have been knocked out by the blow, but although Alex felt the jolt of it running all the way up his body, Miss Stenbush hardly faltered. As Alex left the table, her hand swung down, smashing through the thick wood. The table fell apart, and she walked through it, grabbing him again, this time by the neck. Alex felt his feet leave the floor. With a grunt, he hurled himself against the wall. Alex yelled, wondering if his back had been broken. He slid to the floor. He couldn't move. Miss Stenbush stopped, breathing heavily. She glanced out of the window. The helicopter's blades were at full speed. The helicopter was rocking forward and rose into the air. It was time to go. She reached down and picked up her handbag. She took out a gun and aimed it at Alex. Alex stared at her. There was nothing he could do. Miss Stenbush smiled. This is my job. And this is my job. This is my job, she said. The dining room door swung open. Alex! Alex! He was holding a machine gun. Miss Stenbush lifted the gun up and fired 3 shots. Each one of them found his target. Wolf was hit in the shoulder, the arm, and the chest. Even as he fell back, he opened fire himself. The heavy bullet slammed into Miss Stenbush. She was hurled backwards into the window, which slammed behind her. With a scream, she disappeared out into the night and the snow, head first, her heavy stockinged legs trailing behind her. The shock of what had happened gave Alex new strength. He got to his feet and ran over to her. The SAS man wasn't dead, but he was badly hurt. His breathing rattling. I'm okay, he managed to say. Came looking for you. Glad I found you. Wolf? Okay. He tapped at his chest, and I saw that he was wearing body armour under his jacket. There was blood coming from his arm, but the other 2 bullets hadn't reached him. Grief, he said. Wolf gestured and looked around. The helicopter had left its launch pad. It was flying low outside the academy. Alex saw Dr. Grief in the pilot's seat. He had a gun. He fired. There was a yell, and a body fell from somewhere above. One of the SAS man. Suddenly, Alex was angry. Grief was a freak, a monster. He was responsible for all this, and he was going to get away. No one was what he was doing. He snatched up Wolf's gun and ran through the broken window, past the dead body of Miss Stellenbosch, and into the night. He tried to aim. The blades of the helicopter were whipping up the surface, but now, blinding him, he pointed his gun up and fired. Nothing happened. He pulled the trigger again. Still nothing. Either Wolf had used all his ammunition, or the gun had jammed. Dr. Reef pulled out the controls, and the helicopter banked away, following the slope of the mountain. It was too late. Nothing could stop him unless Alex threw down the gun and ran forward. There was a snowmobile lying idle a few meters away, its engine still running. The man who had been riding it was lying face down in the snow. Alex slept on the seat and turned the throttle full on. The snowmobile roared away, skimming over the ice. Dr. Reef saw him. The helicopter slowed and turned. Reef raised her hand, waving goodbye. Alex caught sight of the red spectacles, the slender fingers raised in one gesture of defiance. His hands gripping the handles. Alex stood up on the foot grips, tensing himself for what he had to do. The helicopter moved away again, gaining altitude. In front of the Alex, the ski jump loomed up. He was travelling at 78 kilometers an hour. Snow and wind rushing past him. Ahead of him, there was a wooden barrier shaped like a cross. Alex smashed through it and threw himself off. The snowmobile plunged down, its engine screaming. Alex rolled over in the snow. Ice and wood splinters in his eyes and mouth. He managed to get to his knees. The snowmobile reached the end of the ski jump. Alex watched it rocking into the air, propelled by the huge metal slide. In the helicopter, Dr. Reef just had time to see 225 kilograms of solid steel come hurtling towards him out of the night. His headlights blazing, its engine still screaming, his eyes bright red open, wide in shock. The explosion lit up the entire mountain. The snowmobile had become a torpedo and it hit its target with perfect accuracy. The helicopter disappeared into a huge fireball, then plunged down. It was still burning when it hit the ground. Behind him, Alex became aware that the shooting had stopped. The battle was over. He walked slowly back to the academy, shivering suddenly in the cold night air. As he approached, a man appeared at the broken window and waved. It was Wolf, propping himself against the wall, but still very much alive. Alex went over to him. "What happened to Grief?" he asked. "It looks like I slayed him," Alex replied. On the slopes, the wreckage of the helicopter flickered and burned as the morning sun began to rise. Last chapter. Chapter 17. Dead Ringer. A few days later, Alex found himself sitting opposite Alan Blanc in the faceless office in Liverpool Street, with Miss Jones twisting another sweet between her fingers. It was 1st of May, my brother's birthday, a bank holiday in England, but somehow he knew that holidays never came to the building that called itself the Royal and General Bank. Even the spring seemed to have stopped at the window. Outside, the sun was shining. Inside, there were only shadows. It seemed that once again we owe you a debt. Once again we owe you a debt of thanks. A debt of thanks, Blunt was saying. "You don't owe me anything." Blunt looked genuinely "You don't owe me anything," Alex said. Blunt looked genuinely puzzled. "You have quite possibly changed the future of this planet," he said. Of course, Grief's plan was monstrous, crazy, but the fact remains that he searched for a word to describe the test tube creations that have been set out, or point blanc, his offspring. He could have caused a great many problems. At the very least, they would have had money. God knows what they would have got up to have had the remains undiscovered. What's happened to them? Alex asked. "We've traced all 15 of them, and we have them under lock and key." "Yeah, we've traced all 15 of them, and we have them under lock and key," Miss Jones answered. "They were quietly arrested by the intelligence service of each country where they lived. We'll take care of them." Alex shivered. He had a feeling that he knew what Miss Jones meant by those last words, and he was certain that nobody would ever see the 15 Grief replicas again. "Once again we've had to hush this up," Blanc continued. "The whole business of cloning, it caused a great deal of public disquiet. Sheep are one thing, but human beings," he coughed, "the families involved in this big business have no desire for publicity. They won't be talking. They're just glad to have their real sons returned to them. The same, of course, goes for you, Alex. You've already signed the official secret act. I'm sure we can trust you to be discreet." There was a moment's pause. Miss Jones looked carefully at Alex. She had to admit that she was worried about him. She knew everything that had happened at Point Blanc, how close he had come to a horrible death, only to be sent back into the academy for the second time. The boy who had come back from the French Alps was different to the boy who had left. There was a coldness about him as tangible as mountain snow. "You did very well about Alex," she said. "You did very well, Alex," she said. "How is Wolf?" Alex asked. He's fine. He's still in hospital, but the doctors say he'll make a complete recovery. We hope to have him back on operations in a few weeks." "That's good." "We only have one fatal in the raid on Point Blanc. That was the man you saw falling from the roof. Wolf and another man was injured. Otherwise, it was a complete success." She paused. "Is there anything you want to know?" "No," Alex shook his head. He said, "You left me in there," he said. "Called for help, but you didn't come. Grief was going to kill me, but you didn't care." "That's not true, Alex." Lizard looked at Blunt for support, but he didn't meet her eyes. There were difficulties. "It doesn't matter, but I just want you to know that I've had enough. I don't want to be a spy anymore. And if you ask me again, I refuse. I know you think you can blackmail me, but I know too much about you now, so that won't work anymore. He walked over to the door. I used to think that being a spy would be exciting and special like in films, but you used me in a way. The two of you are as bad as grief. You'll do anything to get what you want. Well, I want to go back to school. Next time you can do it without me. There was long silence after Alex had left. At last, Blanc spoke. He'll be back, he said. They showed his face an eyebrow. You really think so? He's too good at what he does. Too good at the job. And it's in his blood. He stood up. It's rather odd, he said. Most schoolboys dream of being spies. With Alex, we have a spy who dreams of being a schoolboy. Will you really use him again? Mr. asked. Of course. There was a fire that came in only this morning. An interesting situation in the Zagros Mountains of Iraqua. Alex may be the only answer. He smiled at his number 2. We'll give him a while to settle down, and then we'll call him. He won't answer? We'll see, Blanc said. Alex walked home from the bus stop and let himself into the elegant Chelsea home that he shared with his housekeeper and closest friend, Jack Starbright. After he told Jack where he had been and what he had been doing, the two of them had made agreement to never to discuss his involvement with MI6. She didn't like it, and she worried about him. But at the end of the day, they both knew there was nothing more to be said. He seemed surprised to see him. I thought you'd just gone out, she said. No. Did you see the message by the phone? What message? Mrs. Bray wants to see you this afternoon, 3 o'clock on the morning. Henry Bray was the head teacher at Brookland. Alex was surprised by the summons. Bray was sort of the head, who managed to run a busy, comprehensive, and still find time to take personal interest in every pupil who went there. He had been worried in by Alex's long absence, so he had called a meeting. Do you want lunch? Jack asked. No, thanks. Alex knew that he would have to pretend he had been ill again. Doubtless MI6 would produce another doctor's note in due course, but the thought of lying to his head teacher spoiled his appetite. He set off an hour later, taking his bicycle, which had been returned to the house by the Putney police. He cycled slowly. It was good to be back in London, to be surrounded by normal life. He turned off the King's Road and pedalled down the side road. It felt like a month ago. He had followed the man in the white Skoda. The school loomed up ahead of him. It was empty now, and would remain so until the summer term. But as Alex arrived, he saw a figure walking across the yard to the school gates and recognized Mr. Lee, the elderly school caretaker. You again? Hello, Bernie, Alex said. That's what everyone called him. On your way to see Mr. Bray? Yeah, the caretaker shook his head. He never told me he was going to be here today. But he never tells me anything. I'm just going down to the shops. I'll be back at 5 to look up, so make sure you're out by then. Right, Bernie. There was nobody in the playground. It felt strange walking across the tarmac on its own. The school seemed bigger with nobody there. The yard stretching out too far between the red brick buildings with the sun beating down, reflecting off the windows. Alex was dazzled. He had never seen the place so empty and quiet. Alex was dazzled, quiet. With nobody there, sun beating down. Alex was dazzled. He had never seen the place so empty and so quiet. The grass on the playing fields looked almost too green. Any school without school children has its own peculiar atmosphere, and Brookland was no exception. Mr. Bray had an office in D block, which was next to the science building. Alex reached the swing doors and opened them. The walls The walls here would normally be covered in posters, but they had all been taken down at the end of term. Everything was blank, off-white. There was another door open to one side. Bernie had been cleaning the main laboratory. He had rested his mop and bucket to one side when he'd gone to the shops to pick up 20 cigarettes, had Alex presumed. The man had been a chain smoker all his life, and Alex knew he'd die with a cigarette between his lips. Alex climbed up the stairs, his heels rapping against the stone surface. He reached the corridor left for biology, right for physics, and continued straight ahead. A second corridor with full-length windows and boys inside led into D block. Bray's study was directly ahead of him. He stopped at the door, vaguely wondering if he should have smartened up for the meeting. Bray was always snubbing at boys with their shirts hanging out, or ties crooked. Alex was wearing a denim jacket, t-shirt, jeans, and Nike trainers, the same clothes he had worn that morning at MI6. His hair was still too short for his liking, although he had begun to grow back. All in all, he still looked like a juvenile delinquent, but it was too late now. And anyway, Bray didn't want to see him to discuss his appearance. His non-appearance at all was more to the point. He knocked on the door. "Come in," a voice called. Alex opened the door and walked into the head teacher's study. And cluttered room with views over the playground. There was a desk piled high with papers, and a black leather chair with its back towards the door. The cabinet, full of trophies, stood against one wall. The other was mainly lined with books. "You wanted to see me?" The chair turned slowly around. Alex froze. It wasn't Henry Bray sitting behind the desk. It was himself. He was looking at a 14-year-old boy with fair hair, cut very short, brown eyes, and a slim, pale face. The boy was even dressed identically to him. It took Alex what felt like an eternity to accept what he was seeing. He was standing in a room looking at himself sitting in a chair. The boy was him, with just one difference. The boy was holding a gun. "Sit down," he said. Alex didn't move. He knew what he was facing, and he was angry with himself for not having expected it. When he had been handcuffed at the academy, Dr. Grief had boasted to him that he had been cloned, and he had cloned himself 16 times. But that morning, Miss Jones had traced all 15 of them. That left one spare, one boy waiting to take his place in the family of Sir David Friend. Alex had glimpsed him while he was at the academy. Now I remember the figure with the white mask watching him from the window as he walked over to the ski jump. The white mask had been bandages. The new Alex had been spying on him as he recovered from the plastic surgery that had made the two of them identical. Even today there had been clues. Perhaps it had been the heat on him as he recovered from the plastic surgery that had made the two of them identical. Even today there had been clues. Perhaps it had been the heat of the sun or the fall, out from his visit to MI6, but he had been too wrapped up on his own thoughts to see them. Jack, when he got home, "I thought you'd gone out. Bernie at the gate. You again?" They had both thought they'd just seen him, and in a sense they had. They had seen the boy sitting opposite him. Now the boy who was aiming a gun at his heart. "I've been looking forward to this," the other boy said, despite the hatred in his voice. And he couldn't help marveling. The voice wasn't the same as his. The boy hadn't had enough time to get it right, but otherwise he was a dead ringer. "What are you doing here?" Alex said. "It's all over. The Gemini project is finished. You might as well turn yourself in. You need help." I need just one thing," the second Alex sneered. "I need to see you dead. I'm going to shoot you. I'm going to do it now. You killed my father." Alex said, "You never had a mother or father, you freak. Had made in the Alps like a cuckoo clock. What are you going to do when you've killed me? Take my place? You wouldn't last a week. You may look like me, but too many people know what Grief was trying to do. And I'm sorry, but you've got fake written all over you. We would have had everything. We would have had the whole world. The replica Alex almost screamed the words, and for a moment Alex thought he heard Grease somewhere in there blaming him from beyond the grave. But then the creature in front of him was Dr. Grief, or part of him. I don't care what happens to me, he went on, just so long as you're dead. The hand was with the gun stretched out, but the barrel was pointing at him. Alex looked the boy straight in the eye, and he saw the hesitation. The fake Alex couldn't quite bring himself to do it. They were too similar, the same height, the same build, the same face. For the other boy, it would be like shooting himself. Alex still hadn't closed the door. He threw himself backward into the corridor. At the same time the gun went off, the bullet exploded a millimetre above his head, crashing into the fair wall. Alex hit the ground on his back and rolled out of the doorway. As the second bullet slammed into the floor, and then he was running, putting as much space between him and as his double as he could. There was a third shot, and as he sprinted down the corridor, and the window next to him shattered glass showering down. Alex reached the stairs and took them three at a time, afraid that he would trip and break an ankle. But then he was at the bottom, heading for the main door, swerving only when he realized that he would make too easy a target as he crossed the playground. Instead, he dived into the laboratory, almost falling headfirst over, burning bucket and mop. The laboratory was long and rectangular, dived into workstations with Bunsen burners, flasks, and dozens of bottles of chemicals spread out on shelves that stretched the full length of the room. There was another door at the far end. I dived behind the furthest desk. Would his double have seen him come in? Might he be looking for him? Even now, out in the yard. Cautiously, Alex poked his head over the surface, then ducked down as 4 bullets ricocheted around him, splintering the wood, smashing one of the gas pipes, and he heard the hiss of escaping. There was another gunshot and an explosion that hurled him backwards, sprawling onto the floor. The last bullet had ignited the glass, flames leaping up, licking at the ceiling. Then the sprinkler system went off, spraying the entire floor. Alex tracked back on his hands and feet, searching for shelter behind fire and water, hoping that the other Alex would be blinded. His shoulders hit the far door. He scrambled to his feet. There was another shot, but then he was through, with another corridor and a second flight of stairs straight ahead. The stairs led nowhere. He was halfway up before he remembered there was a single classroom at the top, used for biology. It had a spiral staircase leading to the roof, and the school had so little land that they planned to build a roof garden. They'd run out of money. There was a couple of greenhouses, nothing more. There was no way down. Alex looked over his shoulder and saw the other Alex reloading his gun already on his way up. He had no choice. He had to continue, even though he knew that he was soon going to be trapped. He reached the biology classroom and slammed the door shut behind him. There was no lock, and the tables were bolted into the floor. Otherwise, he might have been able to make a barricade. The spiral staircase was ahead of him. He ran up it without stopping, through another door, and out onto the roof. Alex stopped to catch his breath and see what he could do next. He was standing on a wide, flat area with a fence running all the way around. There were half a dozen terracotta pots filled with earth. A few plants sprouted out, looking for more dead than alive. Alex sniffed the air. Smoke was curling out from the window 2 floors below, and he realized that the sprinkler system had failed to put out the fire. He thought of the gas pouring into on the boom shelves. He could be standing on a time bomb. He had to find a way down, but then he heard feet on metal and realized that his double had reached the top of the spiral staircase. Alex ducked behind one of the greenhouses. The door crashed open. Smoke followed the fake Alex out of the roof. He took a step forward, and now Alex was behind him. "Where are you?" shouted the double. His hair was soaked and his face contorted with anger. Alex knew his moment had come. He would never have a better chance. He ran forward. The other twisted around and fired. The bullet creased his shoulders, a molten sword drawn across his flesh. Then he had reached his replica, grabbing him around the neck with one hand and seizing hold of his wrist. With the other forcing the gun away, there was a huge explosion in the laboratory below, and the entire building shook. But neither voice seemed to notice it. They were locked in an embrace, 2 reflections that had become tangled up in the mirror, the gun over their heads, fighting for control. The flames were tearing through the building, fed by variety of chemicals. They burst through the roof, melting the asphalt, In the far distance, the scream of fire engines penetrated the sun, filled the air, and he pulled with all his strength, trying to bring the gun down. The alligators clawed at him, swearing not in English but in Afrikaans. The end came very suddenly. The gun twisted and fell to the ground. Alex lashed out, knocking the other down, then dived for the gun. There was another explosion, and a sheet of chemical flame leapt up. A crater had suddenly appeared in the roof, swallowing up the gun. The boy saw it too late and fell through. With a yell, he disappeared into the smoke and fire. One Alex rider walked over to the hole and looked down. The Alex rider lay on his back, 2 floors below him. He wasn't moving, the flame closing in. The fire agent had arrived at the school. A ladder slanted up towards the roof. A boy with short, fat hair, fair hair and brown eyes, wearing a denim jacket, T-shirt and jeans, walked to the edge of the roof and began to climb down. Right, everybody, that's the end of me reading you this book. So, everybody, the next time you hear me reading Alex Rider, it will be Alex Rider and the Skeleton's Key. So, bye-bye, and thank you for listening to this, this exciting, adventurous, adrenaline action adventure movie of Alex Rider again. So, bye-bye, and thank you for listening to this.